He raised 7 orphans like his own, pouring his heart into building a family. But years later, a shocking truth shatters the life he thought he knew. A mysterious note appears, hinting at secrets buried in his wife's past. A van full of frightened children abandoned on his doorstep, and a shadowy figure watching, waiting. Each discovery pulls him deeper into a web of lies and danger. Who left the children in his care? What dark secret cost his wife her life? And how far will he go to protect the family he's come to love? The answers will change everything, but at what cost? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The early morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of Ethan Carter's workshop, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The familiar scent of fresh pine filled the air as his weathered hands guided the sandpaper along the curved arm of a rocking chair. Each stroke was deliberate, practiced, a meditation that helped quiet his mind. Sawdust danced in the beams of light, and the gentle patter of rain on the tin roof created a soothing rhythm. Ethan paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and his eyes drifted to the shelf where Claire's photograph sat. Her bright smile, frozen in time, seemed to light up even the darkest corners of the workshop. 5 years had passed since the accident, but the ache in his chest felt just as fresh as the day he lost her. "Almost got it right this time," he murmured to the photo, running his fingers along the smooth wood of the chair. Claire had always loved his handcrafted furniture, especially the rocking chairs. She used to say they had soul, unlike the mass-produced pieces in stores. The rain picked up, drumming harder against the roof. Ethan checked his watch. Time to head into town for supplies. He carefully covered the unfinished chair with a drop cloth, his movements precise and methodical, like everything else in his life these days. Main Street was quiet when he arrived, the wet pavement reflecting the gray sky above. The hardware store's bell chimed as he pushed open the door, and old Tom behind the counter gave his usual nod. "Morning, Ethan." "Morning," Ethan replied softly, already heading toward the varnish aisle. He knew exactly where everything was, had known for years. The routine was comfortable, safe. No surprises, no disappointments. As he selected his items, Mrs. Peterson from the bakery walked by with her grandson. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Ethan?" she called out. He managed a polite nod, watching as the little boy tugged on his grandmother's hand, eager to get to the candy display. Outside the store's window, a young family huddled under an umbrella, their children splashing in puddles despite their mother's protests. The father scooped up the smallest child, spinning her around as she squealed with delight. Ethan felt that familiar twist in his gut, the one that reminded him of all the dreams he and Claire had shared, all the plans that died with her. Back home, the silence enveloped him like a heavy blanket. The house was neat, orderly, everything in its place, and completely lifeless. Ethan moved to the mantel where Claire's favorite photo stood. She was laughing in this one, her head thrown back, hair catching the sun. He carefully lifted the frame, wiping away non-existent dust with tender attention. Walking to the old record player in the corner, he selected one of Claire's beloved piano albums. The gentle notes filled the empty space, and for a moment, he could almost pretend she was just in the other room about to walk in and ask about his day. But she wasn't, and the music only seemed to emphasize the hollow spaces where a family should be. Ethan sank into his armchair, listening to the rain and piano notes mingle, wondering, as he often did, if this was all his life would ever be, a collection of quiet moments, memories of Claire, and the endless echo of what might have been. The rain continued its steady pattern on the roof, marking time in a house where time seemed to stand still, frozen in the moment when Claire's laugh last echoed through these rooms. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Ethan finished cleaning his tools for the night. The workshop's familiar comfort felt different somehow, almost electric with the approaching storm. He was about to turn off the lights when a strange metallic sound caught his attention, something between a sputter and a clank coming from the edge of his property. Frowning, he grabbed the old brass lantern from its hook by the door. The rain had picked up, falling in heavy sheets now. Lightning flashed, illuminating a shape through the curtain of water. A van, its headlights weakly flickering like dying fireflies. "Hello?" Ethan called out, raising the lantern higher. No response came except for another crack of thunder. The wind whipped at his jacket as he made his way toward the vehicle, his boots squelching in the mud. The van looked abandoned, its white paint dulled by dirt and age. But as Ethan drew closer, he noticed movement behind the foggy windows. His heart quickened. Something wasn't right. When he reached the driver's side door, he found it unlocked. Opening it carefully, he lifted his lantern, and his breath caught in his throat. 7 small faces stared back at him, wide-eyed and frightened, huddled together like scared rabbits. "It's okay," Ethan said softly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm not going to hurt you." A girl with dark braids, who looked to be the oldest, shifted protectively in front of the others. Her chin trembled, but her eyes held a fierce determination that reminded Ethan of Claire. "My name is Ethan," he continued, keeping his voice gentle. "You must be freezing out here. I have a warm house just over there." He pointed toward the lights of his home. The children remained silent, but their shivering was visible. 2 of the youngest ones, identical twin girls with red curls, clung to each other, their lips tinged slightly blue from the cold. "Please," Ethan said. "Let me help you." The older girl studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Ethan's heart ached at their obvious fear and confusion. What were 7 children doing alone in a van during a storm? Moving slowly, he helped them out one by one. The smallest boy stumbled, and Ethan caught him instinctively. The child felt like ice in his arms. They hurried through the rain to his house, the children staying close together. Inside the warm living room, they stood in a tight cluster, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. Ethan didn't care about the mess. He was too worried about their condition. "Wait here," he said, quickly gathering every blanket he could find. He wrapped each child carefully, noting their wary expressions and trembling hands. The older girl kept count, her eyes darting between her companions as if afraid one might disappear. "Hot cocoa," Ethan muttered, heading to the kitchen. "You all need something warm." He could feel their eyes following his every move as he filled the kettle and set it on the stove. Lightning illuminated the room, followed by a tremendous crack of thunder that rattled the windows. Several of the children jumped, and the youngest boy let out a small whimper. "It's okay," Ethan assured them, returning to the living room. "You're safe here." He sat down in his armchair, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Would you tell me your names?" The children exchanged glances, but remained silent. The older girl pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her protective stance never wavering. Behind her, the others huddled closer together as another rumble of thunder shook the house. The children sat in a tight circle on Ethan's living room floor, their small hands gripping blankets like shields. The storm continued its assault outside, but the warm glow of table lamps created a cozy sanctuary within. Ethan watched them from his position by the kitchen doorway, 7 mugs of hot cocoa carefully arranged on a wooden tray he'd made years ago. Sophia, the girl with dark braids, maintained her vigilant watch over the others. Her shoulders were squared, trying to appear bigger than her 7 years would allow. Next to her, Max's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail as if searching for hidden dangers. His hands never stopped moving, fidgeting with the edge of his blanket. Ella clutched a worn cloth doll to her chest, its fabric faded and threading loose at the seams. Her lower lip trembled occasionally, but she found comfort in Ben's presence beside her. Despite being only 6, Ben had a gentle demeanor that seemed to calm the others. He offered small, reassuring smiles to his companions, especially when thunder made them jump. The twin girls, Rose and Lily, whispered to each other, their red curls still damp from the rain. Every now and then they'd break into nervous giggles as if sharing secret jokes to keep their fears at bay. Little Tommy, the quietest of the group, sucked his thumb while leaning against Sophia's shoulder, his eyelids growing heavy. "Here we go," Ethan said softly, approaching with the tray. "Careful now, it's still hot." He handed out the mugs one by one, making sure each child had a secure grip before letting go. The rich scent of chocolate filled the air, bringing a ghost of a smile to some of their faces. "Can you tell me where you came from?" he asked gently, settling into his armchair. The children exchanged glances but remained silent. Or maybe who brought you here? Sophia shook her head slightly, her grip tightening on her mug. The others followed her lead, some staring into their cocoa as if the answers might be floating there. Moving to the kitchen counter, Ethan began preparing simple sandwiches. The bread was fresh. He'd bought it just that morning, never imagining he'd be feeding 7 unexpected guests. As he spread peanut butter and jelly, a soft sobbing sound reached his ears. Looking back, he saw Ella wiping tears from her cheeks, her doll clutched tightly against her chest. Sophia had one arm around her, patting her back with a tenderness that made Ethan's heart ache. The scene stirred memories of Claire, how naturally caring she had been, how she would have known exactly what to say to these frightened children. The storm began to lose its fury as the night wore on. Ethan stood by the window, watching raindrops trace paths down the glass. On the small side table nearby, Claire's photograph caught the light of a flickering candle. Her smile seemed to hold a message he couldn't quite decode. In the living room, the children had finally succumbed to exhaustion. They lay curled together on the makeshift beds he'd created from spare blankets and cushions. Tommy still sucked his thumb in his sleep, while the twins held hands even in slumber. Sophia had positioned herself at the edge of the group, as if standing guard even in rest. Ethan knew he needed to call the authorities in the morning. These children needed help, professional help, and there had to be people looking for them. Yet as he watched them sleep, questions nagged at his mind. Who would abandon 7 children in a broken-down van during a storm? What had they been running from? Or running to? He sighed quietly, his reflection in the rain-streaked window looking as troubled as he felt. The responsibility of these 7 young lives weighed heavily on his shoulders, if only for one night. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches on the worn wooden floor. The aroma of cinnamon-spiced oatmeal filled the air as Ethan stirred the large pot on the stove. He'd added brown sugar and a pinch of salt, just the way Claire used to make it. The children shuffled into the kitchen, their hair tousled from sleep, blankets still wrapped around their shoulders. They looked less frightened than the night before, though wariness still lingered in their eyes. Ethan noticed how they moved as a unit, always staying close to one another. "Good morning?" Ethan said softly, ladling the steaming oatmeal into 7 colorful bowls. "I hope you all slept okay." The children settled around the large oak table, their feet dangling from chairs that seemed too big for them. Tommy rubbed his eyes sleepily while Rose and Lily exchanged whispered words. Ben helped Ella climb onto her chair, showing the same gentle care he'd displayed the previous night. Max, who had been watching Ethan intently, picked up his spoon and dipped it into his bowl. His eyes widened at the first taste and a small smile crept across his face. He turned to Lily, who sat beside him, and held up a spoonful of oatmeal. "Want some?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first words any of them had spoken that morning. Lily giggled as Max made airplane noises, guiding the spoon toward her mouth. Rose watched her twin sister with amusement, while Ben and Ella shared small grins. Even Sophia's stern expression softened at the display. Ethan's heart warmed at the scene. These children, who had arrived so scared and silent, were beginning to show glimpses of what they might be like when feeling safe and secure. As Ethan cleared away the empty bowls, Sophia approached him at the sink. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words careful and measured, "for the food and everything." Later that morning, Ethan stepped out onto his front porch, needing a moment to clear his head and plan his next steps. The air was fresh after the storm, and puddles dotted his gravel driveway. He knew he needed to contact the authorities, but something made him hesitate. His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed something unusual, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath one of Claire's old terracotta flower pots. His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved it. The paper was cream-colored and slightly damp from the morning dew. Unfolding it carefully, Ethan read the message written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. "You owe them more than you'll ever know." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, scanning the yard and the tree line beyond, but saw only empty space and swaying branches. The message sent a chill down his spine despite the warm morning sun. What did it mean? Why these children? Why him? At noon, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, phone in hand. Through the doorway, he could see the children in the living room. They had found some old playing cards and were engaged in what appeared to be a game of their own invention, with rules only they understood. Taking a deep breath, he dialed the sheriff's department. His finger shook slightly as he pressed each number. "Sheriff's Department," a gruff voice answered. "Yes, hello," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to report. Well, I found 7 children last night, in a broken-down van near my property." He explained the situation, his eyes never leaving the children as they played. When he mentioned the mysterious note, the officer's response was surprisingly dismissive. "Someone from social services will be in touch," the officer said flatly. "Keep the children there for now." The call ended, leaving Ethan feeling more unsettled than before. In the living room, Tommy's laugh rang out as Max made a silly face at him. The sound echoed through the house, making it feel more alive than it had in years. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Ethan's front windows when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. The children, who had been playing a makeshift card game, instantly huddled together like startled rabbits. Ethan's heart tightened at their reaction as he walked to answer the door. A young woman in a navy blazer stood on his porch, her messenger bag slung professionally across her shoulder. Her warm brown eyes contrasted with her businesslike demeanor. "Mr. Carter? I'm Emma Phillips from Social Services," she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm but gentle. "I'm here about the children you reported." Ethan stepped aside to let her in. "Yes, of course. Please come in, Ms. Phillips." Emma's gaze swept the living room, taking in the scattered playing cards, the blankets still folded neatly on the couch, and the 7 children who now pressed against each other in a protective cluster. Her expression softened slightly at their obvious fear. "The children were in a broken-down van just outside my workshop," Ethan explained, keeping his voice low. "It was during last night's storm. I couldn't just leave them out there." Emma nodded, jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "And you found them around what time?" "Must have been close to 9. The storm was getting worse, and I heard something that sounded like engine trouble." Emma walked slowly around the living room, her trained eye taking in details. She paused at the kitchen doorway, noting the clean dishes drying on the rack and the pot of oatmeal still sitting on the stove. "You've been feeding them, making sure they're comfortable," she observed. It wasn't quite a question. "They were hungry and scared," Ethan replied simply. Emma sat down on the armchair, her posture professional but approachable. She turned her attention to the children. "Hi there," she said gently. "I'm Emma. Would you mind telling me your names?" The children remained silent, looking to Sophia for guidance. The eldest girl stepped forward slightly, though she kept one hand on Max's shoulder. "I'm Sophia," she said quietly. "These are my—" She hesitated for a moment. "My brothers and sisters." Emma's pen moved across her notebook. "Do you remember who brought you here, Sophia? Or where you came from?" Sophia shook her head, her eyes downcast. "We were just in the van. For a long time." "And before the van?" Emma pressed gently. I can't remember," Sophia whispered, distress evident in her voice. Ethan cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said, retrieving the note from his pocket. "I found this on my porch this morning." Emma took the cream-colored paper, her brow furrowing as she read the cryptic message. "You owe them more than you'll ever know," she read aloud. "This is unusual." She tucked the note into her bag. "I'll need to run some background checks, see if there are any missing persons reports that match these children's descriptions." Standing up, Emma gathered her things. "Mr. Carter, I'll need to ask you to keep the children here for now. It's not ideal, but until we can identify them and find proper placement, this is the safest option." At the word placement, the children pressed closer together. Little Tommy grabbed Ben's hand, while Rose and Lily clung to each other. Emma walked to the front door, Ethan following. On the porch, she turned to him. "I'll be back as soon as I have more information. Make sure they stay safe and comfortable." Ethan watched her car disappear down his gravel driveway. When he turned back to the house, he saw 7 small faces pressed against the living room window, their expressions a mixture of hope and fear. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar protective instinct. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring them or himself. Early morning sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, casting warm golden patches across Ethan's workbench. The familiar scent of sawdust filled the air as he carefully guided his carving knife along the small piece of pine wood in his hands. The gentle scraping sounds of his work mingled with the cheerful squeals and laughter drifting from the house. "Can't catch me!" Max's voice rang out, followed by the thunder of small feet racing down the hallway. "No running inside," Sophia's responsible tone carried through the open window, making Ethan smile despite himself. He paused in his work, studying the emerging shape of a bird taking form beneath his skilled hands. The wood was smooth and pale, perfect for small fingers to hold. As he worked on the delicate details of the feathers, Ethan realized how different his workshop felt now. The silence that had been his constant companion for 5 years had been replaced by the sounds of life and joy. Later that morning, Ethan stepped out into his backyard, heading toward the woodpile. The air was crisp, and dew still clung to the grass. As he approached the fence, something caught his eye. There, in the soft earth near the garden, were several sets of small footprints, clearly belonging to the children. But among them, he noticed something that made his chest tighten: large boot prints, deep and purposeful, leading away from his property. Ethan's eyes followed the trail to where it disappeared into the tree line. These weren't his prints. He knew that immediately. The pattern was unfamiliar, and they were too fresh to have been there from before the storm. Someone had been watching his house. The cheerful sounds from inside suddenly seemed more fragile, more precious. Ethan gathered the firewood quickly, his movements sharp with renewed vigilance. The mysterious note from yesterday took on a darker meaning now. Someone knew these children were here, someone who might be watching even now. Back inside, Ethan tried to push his worries aside as he gathered the children in the living room. Their faces lit up with curiosity as he pulled out the wooden bird he'd been carving. Tommy, usually the shyest, was the first to reach for it, his small fingers gentle as he traced the carved feathers. "It's so pretty," Ella whispered, leaning in for a closer look. "Can you make more?" Ben asked hopefully while Rose and Lily nodded eagerly beside him. "One for each of us?" Max added, his eyes bright with excitement. Ethan found himself nodding, touched by their enthusiasm. "I'll make something special for each of you," he promised. Sophia hung back slightly, watching the scene with careful eyes that seemed too old for her young face. When she caught Ethan's gaze, she offered a small, grateful smile that reminded him painfully of Claire. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ethan placed the wooden bird on the shelf beside Claire's photograph. The two items seemed to belong together somehow. Claire's warm smile and the tiny carved creature that had brought such joy to the children. Looking at them, Ethan felt something shift in his heart. These children, who had arrived so mysteriously in the night, were becoming more than just temporary guests. They were becoming family. Yet even as he watched them play, his mind kept returning to those boot prints in the mud. Someone was out there. Someone who knew more than they were telling. Ethan's jaw set with determination. Whatever was going on, whoever had left those children in his care, he would protect them. They were his responsibility now, and he wouldn't let anyone harm them. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows as Sophia knelt beside her younger siblings. Her small fingers worked carefully with Ella's shoelaces, demonstrating the proper technique. "See? Loop it like this, then pull it through," she explained patiently. Tommy watched intently, his own untied shoes waiting their turn. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, a warm feeling spreading in his chest as he observed the scene. Sophia's gentle guidance reminded him of Claire, the same nurturing spirit, the same quiet strength. Ella's face scrunched in concentration as she attempted to copy Sophia's movements, while Tommy clutched his teddy bear, waiting his turn. "Like this?" Ella asked, holding up a somewhat crooked bow. Perfect, Sophia praised, giving her sister an encouraging smile. Now you try, Tommy. Ben, who had been quietly watching from the couch, slipped down and padded over to where Ethan stood. The boy's presence was always calming, less boisterous than the others. He looked up at Ethan with serious eyes. Mr. Carter? Ben's voice was soft but clear. Can we stay with you for a long time? The question caught Ethan off guard, making his heart squeeze painfully in his chest. He looked down at Ben's hopeful face, seeing the same longing reflected in the eyes of the other children who had paused their shoe-tying lesson to listen. Ethan began, but the words stuck in his throat. Later that morning, Ethan's footsteps echoed through the hushed interior of the town library. The old building smelled of aged paper and wood polish, its floorboards creaking beneath his feet. Tall shelves lined with books stretched toward the ceiling, and morning light filtered through dusty windows. He made his way to the newspaper archives section, running his finger along the spines of bound volumes. Finding the right year, he carefully pulled out a heavy book of collected newspapers. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, searching for any mention of Claire's charity work. After several minutes of careful searching, he found what he was looking for. There, in slightly faded print, was a photograph of Claire's bright smile. The article detailed a successful fundraiser she'd organized for a children's welfare organization. Ethan's throat tightened as he read about her passionate speech on protecting vulnerable children. I didn't expect to find you here. The quiet voice made Ethan start. He looked up to find Emma Phillips standing between the shelves, a stack of papers in her arms. Her expression was a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Ms. Phillips? Ethan nodded, instinctively moving to cover the newspaper article. Please, call me Emma, she said, stepping closer. Her eyes flickered to the newspaper. Looking into something? There was a moment of tension as they regarded each other. Finally, Ethan sighed and moved his arm, revealing Claire's photograph. My wife, he explained simply. She was involved in children's charities before she died. Emma's professional demeanor softened slightly. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. The children, she began hesitantly. I can't find any record of them. No birth certificates, no school records, nothing in any adoption registry. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note. He smoothed it out on the table between them. Emma leaned forward to read it, her brow furrowing. You owe them more than you'll ever know, she read aloud. Looking up at Ethan, she added, Something about this whole situation feels wrong. These children appearing at your doorstep, this cryptic message, their missing records. Will you help me figure out what's going on? Ethan asked, meeting her gaze. Emma was quiet for a moment, studying him. Finally, she nodded. I will, but we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's bigger than just 7 lost children. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ethan's workshop as he carefully spread the photocopied newspaper clippings across his weathered workbench. The familiar scent of sawdust and varnish filled the air as he leaned over the yellowed pages, his fingers tracing each line of text with deliberate care. One article caught his attention. The headline read, New Horizons Foundation hosts annual fundraiser. Claire's name appeared halfway through the piece, describing her as a dedicated volunteer who had recently begun working closely with the foundation's investigative team. Ethan's heart quickened. He'd never known about any investigative work. Another clipping mentioned Claire giving an impassioned speech about protecting vulnerable children. The article noted that she had embarked on a special project to ensure child welfare, though details were frustratingly vague. Ethan ran his hand through his hair, feeling the pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Through the workshop window, he could see Max, Rose, and Lily darting around the backyard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Max ducked behind an old oak tree while Rose covered her eyes, counting loudly. Ready or not, here I come, she called out, her voice full of childhood excitement. Lily scrambled behind a bush, giggling. Near the porch, Ella sat on the steps, her legs swinging rhythmically as she hummed a gentle lullaby. The melody was sweet and somehow familiar, though Ethan couldn't place it. He watched the peaceful scene, his heart full yet troubled. A sudden movement near the fence line caught his attention. The branches of a bush rustled unnaturally, too deliberate to be the wind. Ethan's protective instincts kicked in immediately. He rushed across the yard, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. "Who's there?" he called out firmly, his voice carrying across the property. The children stopped their game, watching him with wide eyes. The only response was the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of birds. Ethan carefully examined the area around the fence, finding disturbed soil and what looked like fresh footprints leading away from his property. Inside the house later that night, Ethan gathered Sophia and Ben in the living room, while the younger children played quietly nearby. The warm lamplight cast a cozy glow, but his expression was serious. "I need you both to be extra careful," he said softly, looking between their young faces. "Keep an eye out for any strangers, and make sure none of you wander off alone. Can you do that for me?" Sophia nodded solemnly, her natural protective instincts showing in her straight posture. "I'll watch out for everyone, Mr. Carter," she promised. Ben's quiet "Yes, sir," followed. After tucking the children into bed, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with Claire's obituary spread before him. The words seemed to take on new meaning now. Claire Carter, 35, passed away in a tragic car accident. She will be remembered as a fierce advocate for children, dedicating her final years to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. His fingers traced her smiling face in the accompanying photograph. What had Claire discovered? What dangerous truth had she been pursuing? The mention of her being a fierce advocate felt weighted with significance he'd missed before. Looking at her picture, Ethan could almost feel Claire's determination, her unwavering commitment to protecting children who needed help. The house creaked and settled around him as night deepened. Somewhere upstairs, a child coughed softly in their sleep. Ethan carefully folded the obituary, his resolve strengthening. Whatever Claire had discovered, whatever had brought these 7 children to his door, he would find out the truth. The small-town diner buzzed with the quiet chatter of late-morning regulars. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, catching dust motes in golden beams that danced above the worn formica tables. Ethan sat across from Emma Phillips in a corner booth, his coffee growing cold as he watched her flip through a slim manila folder. Emma's professional demeanor cracked slightly as she pushed the folder aside with a frustrated sigh. "There's nothing, Mr. Carter. No missing persons reports, no adoption records, nothing in any of the standard databases that matches these children's descriptions." Ethan wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, feeling the lingering warmth. That can't be right. 7 children don't just appear out of nowhere. Exactly. Emma lowered her voice, leaning forward. "I've seen cases of questionable adoptions before, but this..." She shook her head. "This feels different, more organized, like someone deliberately kept these kids off the books." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "I found something about my late wife, Claire. She was working with an organization called New Horizons Foundation before she died." Emma's posture stiffened, her fingers tightening around her pen. "New Horizons?" Her voice carried a note of recognition. "I remember hearing rumors about them years ago. Something about private adoption deals that didn't quite add up. Nothing was ever proven, but..." After their meeting, Ethan took the long way home, his truck rumbling down an old back road he rarely traveled. The pavement was cracked, weeds pushing through the forgotten asphalt. That's when he saw it. An abandoned warehouse looming against the gray sky, its weathered walls telling stories of better days. A faded sign hung crooked above the entrance. New Horizons. Most of the letters were barely visible, worn away by years of sun and rain. The windows were boarded up, dark and forbidding. Ethan parked his truck and approached the building, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The heavy metal door refused to budge when he tried it, secured by a rusted padlock. Ethan ran his hand along the rough surface, a chill running down his spine despite the warm day. Something about this place felt wrong. He pulled out his phone and quickly noted the address, knowing he'd need to come back. When Ethan returned home, the atmosphere shifted from the warehouse's oppressive gloom to the warm chaos of childhood. The kitchen table had been transformed into an art studio, covered in scattered crayons and paper. The children sat hunched over their drawings, tongues sticking out in concentration. Tommy looked up as Ethan entered, his face brightening. "Mr. Carter, look what I made." He held up a crayon drawing with the pride only a 5-year-old could muster. Stick figures of different sizes stood in a line, holding hands under a yellow sun. Above them, in wobbly letters, Tommy had written, "My family." Ethan's throat tightened as he took the drawing, careful not to crease the paper. The other children watched him, their eyes full of hope and trust that made his heart ache. These weren't just 7 strangers anymore. They were becoming his family. "It's beautiful, Tommy," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll put it right here on the fridge where everyone can see it." As he secured the drawing with a magnet, Ethan felt the weight of his responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. "I promise," he said softly, looking at each child in turn. "I'm going to keep you all safe." The words felt both like a vow and a burden. He couldn't tell them about the warehouse. Dawn crept through the workshop windows as Ethan paced the sawdust-covered floor, his cell phone pressed to his ear. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine and varnish. He'd found Martin Fields' number in Claire's old address book tucked away in her desk drawer. "Martin Fields speaking," a gruff voice answered on the 4th ring. "Mr. Fields, this is Ethan Carter, Claire Carter's husband." Ethan's voice wavered slightly. "I need to ask you about some work you did with Claire before she died." There was a long pause on the line. "Ethan, I've been expecting this call for years." Martin's voice softened. Claire was more than just a colleague. She was brave. Too brave sometimes. Ethan leaned against his workbench. "What exactly were you two investigating?" "We uncovered something ugly," Martin said, his tone growing serious. "A network of illegal surrogacy operations connected to certain adoption agencies. They were trafficking children, Ethan. Creating fake papers, erasing identities. Claire was close to exposing everything." Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. How close? Too close. Martin's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "That accident of hers. I never believed it was an accident. Listen to me carefully, Ethan. If you're asking these questions now, there must be a reason. Be careful. These people, they're still out there." Later that morning, Ethan sat in his living room trying to process Martin's warnings while watching Ella play with her worn cloth doll. The little girl had arranged several pillows in a circle, creating what she called her doll's family. "This is the mommy pillow," Ella explained softly, patting a faded blue cushion. "And these are all the brothers and sisters." She pointed to the smaller pillows, arranged with careful precision. Ethan watched as the other children gradually joined her game. Sophia helped arrange the pillows, while Max added his toy car to the makeshift family. Ben brought his favorite book to read to the pillow siblings. Rose and Lily crawled into the circle, giggling as they suggested names for each pillow family member. Tommy curled up next to Ella, thumb in his mouth, watching contentedly. The scene brought tears to Ethan's eyes. These 7 children, thrown together by mysterious circumstances, had formed their own family unit. They protected each other, comforted each other, loved each other. The darkness of Martin's revelations seemed far away in the warm light of this moment. In the afternoon, wanting to give the children some fresh air, Ethan took them to old Mr. Johnson's field next door. The vast expanse of green grass stretched toward a line of oak trees in the distance. The children scattered across the field, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Max and Ben raced each other through the tall grass while Rose and Lily picked dandelions. Sophia helped Tommy climb onto a fallen log, holding his hand steady. Ella sat cross-legged in the grass, making a chain from the dandelions the twins brought her. That's when Ethan saw it, a flash of movement near the tree line. A figure stood half-hidden behind an old oak, watching. Ethan's heart jumped into his throat. He squinted against the sun, trying to make out details, but the figure melted into the shadows between the trees. When he looked again, there was nothing there but dancing leaves and shifting shadows. But Ethan knew what he'd seen. His hands trembled as he called the children closer to him, away from the trees. Martin's warning echoed in his mind. Be careful. These people, they're still out there. The children's laughter suddenly seemed fragile in the vast open field. Ethan gathered them close, his eyes scanning the tree line, knowing that somewhere out there someone was watching, waiting, protecting dark secrets that Claire had died trying to expose. Emma's office was a cramped space filled with towering stacks of manila folders and post-it notes in every color imaginable. The morning light filtered through dusty Venetian blinds as Ethan settled into a worn chair across from her desk. "What you're telling me is serious, Ethan," Emma said, her fingers drumming nervously on her desk. "If what Martin Field says is true, we're dealing with something much bigger than abandoned children." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. Claire was investigating illegal adoptions and surrogacy rings. She died before she could expose them. Now these 7 children show up at my doorstep with a note saying I owe them? That can't be a coincidence. Emma ran her hands through her hair, clearly troubled. "I've hit nothing but walls trying to trace their backgrounds. No birth certificates, no records, nothing. It's like they didn't exist before showing up at your house." "That's exactly what Martin said would happen. These people are experts at erasing identities." "Ethan," Emma said carefully, "what you're suggesting would require me to go outside normal channels. I could lose my job, maybe even face legal consequences. And if we do nothing, these children might disappear again." His eyes met hers, pleading. "Please, Emma, help me protect them." She sighed heavily, reaching for her phone. "I have some contacts in neighboring counties. People who owe me favors. I'll see what I can dig up." Later, walking through town, Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. The sidewalk was busy with lunch-hour foot traffic when something caught his eye. A man in an expensive charcoal suit watching him intently from across the street. Their eyes met for a brief moment before the man turned sharply, disappearing down a narrow alley beside the town hall. Ethan jogged across the street, dodging cars. By the time he reached the alley, the man was gone. But there, caught in a crack between the bricks, was a torn piece of paper. Ethan carefully pulled it free. It was a fragment of a business card, cream-colored with elegant typography. Only a few letters were visible. A. Adoption Services. His heart pounding, Ethan tucked the scrap into his wallet. Another piece of the puzzle. Another connection to whoever was behind all this. The afternoon sun was warm when Ethan returned home. He found the children in the kitchen, eager to help prepare dinner. The scene before him made his heart swell. Rose and Lily sat at the table, their small hands busy snapping fresh peas into a bowl, giggling at the popping sounds. Max proudly arranged plates and forks, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he made sure everything lined up perfectly. Sophia stood on a step stool by the counter, squinting at a cookbook. "It says 2 cups of... what's this word?" "Flour," Ethan said softly, coming to stand beside her. "We're making biscuits." Ben carefully measured the flour while Ella sprinkled in salt. Tommy watched from his perch on a kitchen chair, hugging his stuffed bear. Their laughter and chatter filled the kitchen with warmth, chasing away the shadows of Ethan's earlier discoveries. As he helped Tommy wash his hands for dinner, Ethan's gaze drifted to Claire's photograph on the windowsill. The setting sun caught the glass, making her smile seem to glow. "I won't fail them," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the happy chaos of children preparing dinner. "I promise." The attic was thick with dust as Ethan pulled down another cardboard box marked Claire's Papers. Early morning light streamed through the small window, catching particles floating in the air. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the worn box, revealing stacks of letters and documents. Among the papers, a manila folder labeled New Horizons caught his eye. Inside, he found receipts for donations, meeting notes, and correspondence. But what made his breath catch was a half-finished letter in Claire's familiar handwriting. "My dearest children," it began. "I don't know your names yet, but I'm fighting for you. The adoption executives think they've hidden their tracks well, but I've found traces of their financial ledgers. The truth about what they've done to you and so many others will come to light." Ethan's hands shook as he read the words. Claire had been so close to uncovering everything. The letter confirmed his worst fears about her death. Later that day at Henderson's hardware store, Ethan was examining wood stains when two older men's conversation drifted over from the next aisle. "Did you hear about that mess with the adoption agency over in Millbrook?" one said. "Yeah, something fishy going on there for years. My cousin's friend worked as a janitor at their office. Said he saw some strange things. Meetings late at night, paperwork being burned. Wouldn't surprise me if it went deeper than just Millbrook. These things usually do." Ethan's heart raced as he pretended to study the paint samples. The men's gossip confirmed what he was beginning to piece together. Back in his study that afternoon, Ethan spread Claire's documents across his desk. The partial evidence painted a disturbing picture: financial irregularities, suspicious meetings, and repeated mentions of a secret ledger that could expose everything. He carefully arranged the papers, creating a timeline of Claire's investigation. Through the open door, he could hear the children in the living room. Sophia was reading a story to Tommy, while the others played a quiet game with blocks. Their innocent voices contrasted sharply with the dark reality emerging from Claire's papers. Ethan picked up the unfinished letter again, running his fingers over Claire's handwriting. She had died trying to protect these children, or others like them. Now they had found their way to him, and he knew there was only one path forward. He had to finish what Claire started, no matter where it led. The morning air was crisp and damp after the overnight rain. Ethan Carter stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, and froze. There, leading away from his front door, were fresh footprints in the wet earth. His heart skipped a beat as he set down his mug and crouched to examine them. The prints were deep, suggesting someone had stood there for a while. Moving closer to his door, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Fresh scratch marks marred the lock, silvery against the dark metal. Someone had tried to break in during the night. Inside the living room, the children were already awake. Sophia sat cross-legged on the floor with Lily and Rose, helping them piece together a puzzle of a farm scene. Their small hands moved uncertainly over the pieces, their usual cheerfulness dampened by the morning's tension. "Is someone bad coming?" Ella whispered, her lower lip trembling. Ben put his arm around her shoulders, trying to comfort his sister the way he'd seen Ethan do. "Nobody's gonna hurt us," Ben said firmly, but his voice quivered slightly. Max stood at attention by the window, his small frame rigid as he peered out through the curtains. He'd positioned himself like a tiny sentinel, making Ethan's heart ache at how these children had learned to be so watchful. "Everything's going to be okay," Ethan assured them, gathering them close. "I promise I'll keep you all safe." The words felt heavy with responsibility, but he meant every one of them. By afternoon, gravel crunched under tires as Emma Phillips's car pulled into the driveway. Ethan met her at the door, his face grave as he led her to the evidence of the attempted break-in. "Look at these scratch marks," he said quietly, pointing to the lock. "And the footprints. They're still visible in the mud." Emma crouched down, her professional demeanor slipping as concern crossed her face. "This is serious, Ethan. My discreet inquiries about those adoption agencies have stirred something up. People are asking questions about who's looking into old records." She straightened up, brushing dirt from her knees. "We need to be careful. Very careful. Whoever's watching knows we're investigating." "We need to meet somewhere private," Ethan said, lowering his voice. "Compare what we've found." Emma nodded, her eyes darting to the windows where small faces peeked out. "Tomorrow, the old cafe on Maple Street. Early morning, before the crowds." The moon cast long shadows across the abandoned warehouse as Ethan Carter approached its weathered exterior. His heart hammered in his chest, knowing he was crossing a line by breaking in. But Claire's unfinished work and the children's safety drove him forward. Finding a loose board near a side window, he worked it free with trembling hands. The wood groaned as he pulled it away, revealing a narrow opening. Ethan squeezed through, his boots landing softly on the dusty floor inside. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a space frozen in time. Empty shelves lined the walls, and scattered papers littered the ground like fallen leaves. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay and abandonment. In a far corner, partially hidden behind a fallen filing cabinet, Ethan discovered a pile of water-damaged documents. His hands shook as he carefully sorted through them. Most were illegible, but a few pages remained clear enough to read. One document caught his eye: an adoption contract with suspicious terms and astronomical fees. A partially intact ledger page made his breath catch. Column after column listed massive payments, far beyond any legitimate adoption fees. Ethan's suspicions about New Horizons grew stronger with each revelation. A sudden creak echoed through the warehouse. Ethan's flashlight beam jerked toward the sound, then quickly died. He held his breath, clutching the documents to his chest. Another creak, closer this time. Moving as quietly as possible, Ethan crouched behind a stack of wooden crates. His heart pounded so loud he feared it might give him away. A tall figure appeared at the end of the corridor, its shadow stretching in the dim moonlight filtering through broken windows. The mysterious intruder moved with purpose, heading straight for an office door at the far end. Ethan watched as the figure rattled the locked handle forcefully. After a moment of frustrated effort, the stranger turned and strode away, footsteps quick and determined. Ethan waited until the sound of footsteps faded completely before emerging from his hiding place. With shaking hands, he stuffed the discovered documents into his jacket. The warehouse suddenly felt suffocating, dangerous. He made his way back to the loose board, slipped through and disappeared into the night, his mind racing with questions about what he'd found, and who else was looking for answers. The next morning, Ethan climbed the creaky stairs to his attic, his hands still trembling from the previous night's warehouse encounter. Dust motes danced in the pale light streaming through the small window as he moved purposefully toward Claire's old belongings. Something about last night's close call urged him to look deeper, to search places he might have missed before. He pushed aside boxes and old furniture until he reached a heavy wooden trunk in the corner. As he shifted it, a loose floorboard caught his attention. Kneeling down, Ethan discovered a hidden compartment beneath. His heart skipped a beat as he lifted out a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was Claire's personal journal, its leather cover worn soft with use. Ethan's fingers trembled as he traced her familiar handwriting on the first page. Tears welled in his eyes as he held this piece of her close, breathing in the faint scent of her favorite perfume that still clung to its pages. Later that morning, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, carefully turning the journal's delicate pages while the children played quietly in the living room. Their laughter drifted in as he read Claire's increasingly disturbing discoveries. Page after page detailed her investigation, sophisticated surrogacy operations running under the guise of legitimate adoption agencies, children specifically conceived to be sold to wealthy clients, powerful executives protecting their profitable scheme. His hands shook as he reached Claire's final entries. Her last words hinted at a breakthrough. She had identified someone at the very top of the operation. But the journal ended abruptly, the remaining pages blank. The timing of her accident suddenly made terrible sense. Claire hadn't simply died. She had been silenced. That afternoon, Ethan rushed to Emma's office, clutching the journal. Her eyes widened as he spread the pages across her desk, revealing Claire's meticulous notes and damning evidence. Emma's professional composure cracked as she read through the entries, her face growing pale. "These children," Emma whispered, looking up at Ethan. "They must be products of these illegal surrogacy operations." Her voice trembled as she continued. "This goes deeper than we imagined. The people involved, they're powerful enough to make murders look like accidents." Ethan nodded grimly. Claire died trying to expose this. Now we know why. Emma closed the journal carefully, her hands shaking slightly. "We're in this together now," she said firmly. "These children need us to finish what Claire started." They sat in heavy silence, both understanding that they had crossed a point of no return. Claire's journal had revealed the terrible truth they'd been seeking, but that truth came with deadly consequences. The living room felt heavy with tension as Ethan and Emma spread Claire's journal across the coffee table. Through the hallway, they could hear the children's muffled voices from the back room where Ethan had gently asked them to stay. "Look at this," Emma said, pointing to a series of dates and locations. "These adoption proceedings all overlap." She pulled out her own notepad filled with recent findings. "And they match perfectly with the irregular cases I've been tracking." Ethan leaned in closer, his finger tracing down Claire's neat handwriting. She was mapping it all out, connecting every dot. His voice caught slightly as he realized how close Claire had come to exposing everything. Emma methodically cross-referenced names and dates, her social worker's training evident in her careful attention to detail. "Wait," she said suddenly, tapping a particular entry. "This executive's name keeps appearing at crucial points. He seems to have authority over multiple agencies." Their quiet discussion continued until the evening light began to fade. After Emma gathered her notes and left, Ethan stepped out onto the front porch, needing a moment to clear his head. The cool night air did little to ease his racing thoughts. That's when he noticed it. A dark car parked down the street, its headlights off. Ethan took a few steps forward, straining to see better in the darkness. The car's engine suddenly roared to life and it sped away, leaving only the echo of squealing tires. Back inside, Ethan double-checked all the locks before heading upstairs. Sleep refused to come, so he sat up in bed, Claire's journal open on his lap. As he reread passages he'd already memorized, one name jumped out at him: Brandon Ross, underlined twice in Claire's determined hand. Next to it, she'd written, "Key figure. Controls everything from the shadows." Ethan ran his fingers over Claire's words, feeling the indentations her pen had left in the paper. Brandon Ross. The name seemed to pulse with dark significance. Had this man been behind Claire's death? Was he still pulling strings, orchestrating the surveillance and intimidation? In the quiet of his bedroom, Ethan made his decision. He would find Brandon Ross and uncover the truth no matter the cost. He owed it to Claire, to the children, and to all the families who had been victims of this corrupt system. The records office smelled of dust and aging paper as Ethan approached the front desk. Behind it sat an elderly clerk with wire-rimmed glasses and weathered hands that spoke of decades handling documents. "I need information about Brandon Ross," Ethan said quietly. "Particularly any business dealings from 5 to 10 years ago." The clerk peered at him over his glasses, hesitation clear in his pale blue eyes. "That's quite specific." He shuffled in his chair. "Any particular reason?" "Historical research," Ethan replied smoothly, though his heart hammered in his chest. After several long moments, the clerk nodded and disappeared into the back room. He returned with a thick manila folder, handling it like it might bite. "These are public records only," he said firmly. As Ethan flipped through the pages, his fingers trembled. There it was. Brandon Ross's signature on New Horizons Foundation documents, generous funding contributions, board meeting minutes. More importantly, records showed Ross owned a consulting firm called Summit Solutions that closed its doors mere weeks after Claire's accident. The morning sun was high when Ethan stepped into the parking lot behind the building, his mind racing with connections. The sound of rapid footsteps was his only warning before a man in a dark suit appeared, lunging for the folder in Ethan's hands. "Give me those," the man snarled, trying to wrench the documents away. Ethan held tight, his knuckles white. They struggled, papers crumpling between them. The man's face was inches from his, twisted with anger. "Stop digging or you'll regret it," the man hissed before suddenly releasing his grip and running toward a waiting car. Ethan stood there, heart pounding, clutching the wrinkled folder to his chest. His hands shook, but determination steadied his resolve. Back home that afternoon, Ethan watched the children in the living room. They sat on the floor surrounded by art supplies, their faces peaceful in concentration. Sophia approached him shyly, holding up a drawing. "Look," she said softly. The crayon illustration showed two adults, clearly him and Claire, holding hands with 7 small figures. They all had big smiles, standing under a bright yellow sun. Ethan's throat tightened as he took in the simple scene of family and belonging. "It's beautiful," he managed to say, pulling Sophia into a gentle hug. "Are we going to stay with you forever?" she whispered against his shoulder. "Everything will be okay," Ethan promised, holding her close while watching the other children color and play. In his heart, he knew he would face any danger to keep them safe, to honor Claire's sacrifice and to give these precious children the family they deserved. Emma's office felt smaller than usual as Ethan spread out the crumpled property records on her desk. His hands still trembled slightly as he described the parking lot confrontation. "He tried to grab the files right out of my hands," Ethan explained, then threatened me before running off. Emma's normally warm brown eyes hardened with resolve. "I've been making calls," she said, pulling out her own stack of papers. "There's something strange here. None of the children have official adoption records, but I found irregular money transfers through shell companies, large sums all connected to dates that match entries in Claire's journal. They spent the next hour connecting dots until Emma suggested moving somewhere more private. My apartment would be safer to lay everything out," she said. "We need space to see the full picture." At Emma's modest apartment, they commandeered her kitchen table. Papers and sticky notes created a web of connections between names and dates. Ethan's gaze drifted to family photos on the mantel. Emma as a child with her parents, all smiles and summer sunshine. Emma noticed his look and stiffened. Her shoulders tensed as she quickly redirected attention to their work. "Let's focus on the board members," she said, voice tight with unspoken emotion. Together, they compiled a list of everyone connected to Brandon Ross: lawyers who processed paperwork, doctors who might have been involved in the surrogacy program, board members who approved suspicious transactions. Each name represented another thread in the tapestry of corruption Claire had died trying to expose. Ross surrounded himself with powerful people, Emma noted, circling another name. Each one had something to gain. When Ethan finally headed out, the afternoon sun was low in the sky. A black SUV sat idling across the street, its tinted windows concealing its occupants. His heart rate quickened as he climbed into his truck. He immediately called Emma. "There's a black SUV watching your place," he said quietly. "Be careful." "You too," Emma replied. "We're getting close to something big. They know it." "I'll call you tomorrow," Ethan promised, starting his engine. "We need to move carefully now." As he drove home, the weight of their discoveries pressed heavy on his shoulders. Each step forward seemed to increase the danger, but there was no turning back. Not now. Not when they were so close to understanding what Claire had died trying to reveal. The courthouse hallway stretched long and empty, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the worn linoleum floor. Ethan Carter tugged at his tie, feeling out of place in his freshly pressed suit. Emma Phillips stood beside him, clutching a slim folder of documents. "There have been complications," Emma explained quietly. "Every time I try to process the paperwork, something goes wrong. Files get misplaced. Forms get rejected on technicalities. Someone's trying to block us." Ethan nodded grimly. "They don't want any official record of these children." Inside the courtroom, Judge Martha Wilson peered over her reading glasses at the sparse case file. Her weathered face creased with concern as she flipped through the minimal documentation. "Ms. Phillips," the judge addressed Emma, "you're telling me there are no records of these children? No birth certificates? No previous guardianship papers?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Emma replied. "Despite extensive searching, we've found no trace of biological relatives or prior legal custody arrangements." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "And Mr. Carter has been caring for all 7 children since they were abandoned at his property?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan spoke up. "They need stability, protection. I want to give them that." After careful consideration, Judge Wilson made her ruling. "Given the unusual circumstances, I'm granting Mr. Carter temporary guardianship of all 7 children, pending further investigation into their origins." She fixed Ethan with a stern look. "This is a serious responsibility, Mr. Carter." "I understand completely, Your Honor." Back at home, 7 anxious faces greeted Ethan as he stepped through the door. Sophia, the eldest, stepped forward. "What happened?" A smile broke across Ethan's face. "The judge said you can all stay with me." The children erupted in cheers. Little Tommy launched himself into Ethan's arms, while the others crowded around, hugging whatever part of him they could reach. Tears pricked at Ethan's eyes as Tommy pressed his face into Ethan's shoulder. "Don't let anyone take us away," Tommy whispered, his small fingers gripping Ethan's shirt. Ethan held the boy tighter. "I promise, Tommy, you're all staying right here with me." The other children joined in the embrace, creating a warm tangle of small arms and grateful hearts. For the first time since arriving, they truly felt like a family. Emma Phillips sat at her cramped desk, surrounded by stacks of papers. Her fingers traced the delicate handwriting in Claire Carter's journal, cross-referencing dates and names with financial records spread across her computer screen. The morning light barely filtered through her office's dusty blinds as she uncovered a pattern of shell companies, each leading back to Brandon Ross. "Look at this," she muttered to herself, noting down another connection. 3 separate companies, all registered to the same empty office building, had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through New Horizons Foundation. With trembling fingers, she dialed Ethan's number. "Ethan, I've found something. These shell companies, Ross used them to move money through the foundation. It's all here in black and white." Her voice quivered. "But Ethan, every time we get closer, the threats get worse. Yesterday, someone followed me home." In his workshop, Ethan spread the growing collection of evidence across his workbench, pushing aside sawdust and tools. Claire's journal lay open beside financial records and property deeds. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting particles of dust dancing in the air. His eyes drifted to a family photo of the children he'd taken last week. 7 smiling faces looked back at him. The thought of anyone trying to take them made his chest tighten. He remembered Claire's passionate writings about protecting vulnerable children, her plans to save them from corruption. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. Later that afternoon, Emma's car crunched up Ethan's gravel driveway. They sat together on the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath their chairs. "I want to adopt them," Ethan said firmly. "All 7 of them. Legally. Permanently." Emma's eyes welled with tears. "Ethan, that's wonderful. But you know what this means? Ross and his people? They'll see this as a direct challenge. They might—" "I know the risks," Ethan interrupted gently. "But these children need security. They need to know they're not going anywhere. Claire would have wanted this." Emma reached over and squeezed his hand. "Then we'll do it together. We'll fight for them, no matter what comes next." The morning sun streamed through the courthouse's tall windows as Ethan Carter stood before the family court judge. His heart hammered in his chest, while 7 pairs of small feet shuffled behind him. The children were dressed in their Sunday best, pressed shirts, neat dresses, and carefully combed hair. After reviewing the extensive background checks and home studies, the judge announced, her stern expression softening, "I find the petitioner, Ethan Carter, to be a suitable adoptive parent for all 7 children." Sophia squeezed Tommy's hand tighter as the judge lifted her pen. The scratch of ink on paper seemed to echo through the quiet courtroom. When the gavel fell with a definitive crack, tears spilled down Ethan's cheeks. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter, you are now legally their father." Later that afternoon, laughter and the smell of freshly baked cake filled Ethan's backyard. Neighbors mingled while Emma chatted with her social worker colleagues who had supported the adoption. Max and Ben raced around the yard, their dress shirts now untucked. Rose and Lily decorated the picnic table with wildflowers, while Ella helped serve lemonade. Through the kitchen window, Ethan caught sight of Claire's photograph on the mantel. The late afternoon sun touched her smiling face, and for a moment, he could almost feel her presence celebrating with them. The years that followed flowed like a gentle stream. Seasons changed, marked by homework sessions at the kitchen table, where Ethan patiently helped with math problems and spelling tests. Weekends rang with the sound of hammering as they built a treehouse together, Sophia holding the blueprint while Tommy handed up nails. Christmas mornings brought handmade ornaments and carefully wrapped presents. Birthday celebrations featured wobbly homemade cakes and off-key singing. Family dinners became a sacred ritual, 7 growing children crowding around the table, passing dishes and sharing stories of their day. The children's faces changed subtly with time, baby teeth replaced by permanent ones, small hands growing bigger, heights marked on the kitchen doorframe. At 10, 11, and 12 years old, they filled the house with an energy that made it impossible to remember the silence that had once lived there. 5 years after the adoption, the Carter family had found its rhythm. Though questions about their past remained unanswered, Love had built something unshakable. They were, in every way that mattered, a family. The afternoon sun bathed Ethan's living room in warm light as he watched his family go about their daily routines. Sophia, her dark hair pulled back neatly, arranged cheese and crackers on a platter with careful precision. At 12, she had grown into a thoughtful young lady who still mothered her siblings. "That's not how you draw a horse," Max teased, peering over Ben's shoulder at his sketchbook. "It looks more like a weird dog." Ben clutched his artwork closer, his face reddening. "Does not. You just don't understand art." In the corner armchair, Ella remained absorbed in her novel, occasionally pushing her glasses up her nose. Rose and Lily huddled together on the window seat, whispering and breaking into fits of giggles. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully polishing the small wooden bird Ethan had carved for him years ago. Ethan's chest swelled with pride. These were his children now, truly and completely. Later that afternoon, while organizing the attic, Ethan shifted an old trunk. Behind it, partially hidden in shadow, lay a cream-colored envelope. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized Claire's elegant handwriting spelling out his name. With trembling fingers, he opened the sealed envelope. The paper inside felt delicate, as if holding secrets too heavy for its thin pages. "My dearest Ethan," Claire's words began. As he read, his legs weakened, forcing him to sit on a nearby box. Claire's letter detailed her discovery of an illegal surrogacy operation. The 7 children, all half-siblings, had been born through this program. She had planned to adopt them herself while gathering evidence against the corrupt agency. "If you're reading this," Claire had written, "something may have happened to me. I've made powerful enemies, Ethan. These children deserve safety and love. Please finish what I started." Evening settled over the house as Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, Claire's letter lying beside him. Through his window, he could see the children playing basketball in the yard. Max attempted a shot while Sophia called out pointers. The others cheered and laughed. The weight of Claire's words pressed heavily on his heart. His wife's death had been deliberate, a calculated silencing. He glanced at her photograph on the nightstand, understanding now why these specific children had been left at his door 5 years ago. Claire had known. She had tried to save them, and it had cost her everything. Early morning sunlight streamed through Emma's home office windows as Ethan handed her Claire's letter with trembling hands. Emma's professional composure cracked as she read, her eyes widening with each revelation. "I always felt there was more to Claire's work," Emma said, setting down the letter. "The way certain files disappeared, how investigations got shut down." She shook her head. "This confirms everything." They spent the next hour mapping out their strategy. Emma would work her professional network, carefully probing for information about Brandon Ross and the adoption agency. Ethan would chase down old leads, looking for anyone who might have witnessed suspicious activities around the time of Claire's death. At the town cafe, Martin Fields sat hunched over his coffee cup, looking more weathered than when Ethan had last seen him years ago. The retired journalist glanced nervously around the nearly empty dining room before speaking. "Brandon Ross," Martin muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire was right about him. The whole operation, illegal surrogacies, fake adoptions, missing money, it all leads back to him. Martin pulled out a worn notebook, his hands shaking slightly. "There was a woman who worked at Ross's agency. She saw things, kept records, contacted Claire about coming forward." He wrote down a name on a napkin and slid it across the table. "Find her, and you'll have your proof." When Ethan returned home that evening, he found Sophia and Max waiting in the living room. The other children had gone to bed, but these two, his oldest, sat together on the couch. Their faces held a maturity beyond their 12 years. "Dad," Sophia said softly, using the term that still made Ethan's heart swell. "We know you're worried about something. It's about Mom Claire, isn't it?" Max nodded. "We remember more than you think. About before." Sophia reached for Ethan's hand. "If Mom believed in these kids, in us, it means we're special. You're special too." Her words carried wisdom far beyond her years. Ethan pulled them both into a tight hug, fighting back tears. These weren't just children he'd rescued anymore, they were his family, his purpose. Their trust in him strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The abandoned park pavilion stood silent in the afternoon sun, its weathered wood offering a secluded meeting spot away from prying eyes. Emma paced beneath the rustic shelter, her usual professional demeanor cracking as she shared her findings with Ethan. "I found offshore accounts," Emma said, spreading documents across a worn picnic table. "Millions flowing through shell companies, all tied back to Ross's organization." Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a private memo. "But there's more. Someone high up in the executive chain." She paused, her voice growing tight. "Someone I know personally was involved in all of this." Ethan watched Emma's face carefully, noting how she avoided his gaze. Years of working together had taught him to read her subtle shifts in mood. Something about this discovery had shaken her deeply. "There are things about my family," Emma continued hesitantly. "Things I've never talked about. Old wounds, estrangements." She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Whatever it is, Emma, we'll face it together." Driving home in his truck later that afternoon, Ethan noticed a black SUV hanging back in his rearview mirror. He turned down a narrow gravel road, watching as the vehicle followed. His heart pounded as he made a sudden stop, kicking up dust. The SUV's engine roared as it accelerated past him, disappearing around a bend. That evening in his study, Ethan spread Claire's journal and letter across his desk. He began matching dates with Emma's financial records, creating a timeline of events. As patterns emerged, his mind kept returning to Emma's unease at the pavilion, her hints about family secrets. The executive mentioned in the memo, someone close to Emma, someone she knew personally. Ethan's stomach tightened as he considered the implications. The connection to Emma's family seemed more than coincidental, suggesting a deeper, more personal layer to the conspiracy they were unraveling. The abandoned motel's neon sign flickered weakly in the morning light as Ethan Carter and Emma Phillips followed Martin Fields across the cracked parking lot. Room 14's door creaked open, revealing Karen Malone, a thin woman in her 50s who clutched a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Come in quickly," she whispered, glancing nervously at the empty parking lot. Inside the musty room, Karen pulled a thick manila envelope from beneath the mattress. The old springs squeaked as she sat down, lighting another cigarette from the dying ember of her last one. "I kept copies," Karen said, her voice raspy. "The ledgers, the transactions, everything. Couldn't sleep at night knowing what they were doing to those poor children." She handed the envelope to Ethan with shaking hands. But Ross wasn't the mastermind. He answered to someone else, someone who wanted Claire Carter silenced permanently. Emma stood near the window, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Karen's eyes found her, recognition flickering across her weathered face. "Your father, Robert Phillips, was involved from the start." Karen's words fell heavy in the silent room. Emma swayed slightly, color draining from her face. Ethan moved quickly to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder as tears welled in her eyes. "No," Emma whispered, but Karen nodded grimly. "He orchestrated everything, the illegal surrogacies, the cover-ups, Claire's accident. It's all documented in those ledgers." Unable to bear the weight of this revelation, Emma rushed outside into the bright sunlight. Ethan found her leaning against his truck, struggling to breathe through her tears. "My own father," she choked out. "He killed Claire. He's responsible for everything." "This doesn't change who you are," Ethan said quietly, "or what we need to do." Emma wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders. "You're right. We have the evidence now. We can't let family ties stop us from exposing the truth." She looked at the manila envelope in Ethan's hands, her jaw set with determination despite her tear-stained cheeks. The ledgers inside would finally bring justice to Claire's death and protect the children she died trying to save. Emma sat at her desk, papers spread across the surface like fallen leaves. The ledgers told a damning story, one that made her stomach churn. Her father's signature appeared on document after document, each one revealing another layer of corruption. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a transfer record. "He moved $500,000 the day before Claire's accident." Ethan leaned over her shoulder, his presence steady and reassuring. "The timeline matches perfectly with what Karen told us." Emma's hands trembled as she aligned the documents. Illegal surrogacies, forged adoptions, laundered money. It's all here. He even kept records of the hush money payments. "Emma," Ethan said softly, "this will finally bring justice. For Claire. For the children." She nodded, fighting back tears. "I know. It's just, he's my father." Later that evening, Ethan returned home to find Sophia and Max waiting in the living room. The other children played quietly nearby, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Camera flashes lit up the courthouse steps like lightning as Ethan Carter and Emma Phillips made their way through the crowd of journalists. Microphones thrust forward, questions overlapping in a chaotic buzz. The morning sun cast long shadows across the granite steps as Brandon Ross, handcuffed and flanked by officers, was escorted inside. His once powerful presence now diminished in county-issued orange. Inside the hushed courtroom, the prosecutor methodically presented the evidence. Claire Carter's journal, worn and water-stained, lay open on the exhibit table alongside Karen Malone's meticulous ledgers. The jury leaned forward, captivated by the web of corruption being unveiled before them. When Ethan took the stand, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the room fell silent. His voice remained steady as he spoke of Claire's dedication. "She knew something was wrong in that agency," he testified, his eyes growing wet. "She wouldn't stop until those children were safe. Her death..." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "Her death robbed these children of a fierce advocate, someone who would have moved heaven and earth to protect them." The afternoon brought the trial's most dramatic moment. Emma Phillips approached the witness stand, her steps measured and determined. The prosecutor asked her to identify all conspirators present in the courtroom. Emma's gaze swept across the room, landing finally on the defense table. "Brandon Ross," she said clearly, then hesitated for just a moment. "And Robert Phillips, my father." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Robert Phillips, seated behind his lawyers, kept his eyes fixed on the table before him, refusing to meet his daughter's gaze. The judge's gavel cracked through the commotion, demanding order. Emma stood straight-backed in the witness box, tears streaming down her face as she detailed her father's involvement in the conspiracy. Her voice shook, but never wavered as she chose truth over family loyalty, justice over blood. The prosecutor moved with deliberate precision, laying out each piece of evidence before the jury. Financial records spanning decades revealed a twisted web of illegal transactions. Claire's journal, its pages worn with time, told a story of determined investigation and mounting danger. Karen Malone's ledgers provided the final, damning connections. "These documents," the prosecutor stated firmly, "show a clear pattern of illegal surrogacy operations, falsified adoptions, and systematic cover-ups." Brandon Ross shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident facade cracking with each new revelation. Beside him, Robert Phillips maintained an icy demeanor, his face a mask of stone as his crimes were exposed one by one. "The children in question," the prosecutor continued, gesturing to a stack of files, "have no legal documentation within any legitimate foster system. They were, in effect, invisible by design." From his seat in the gallery, Ethan watched the proceedings intently. The judge leaned forward, studying each piece of evidence with careful consideration. Ross's defense attorney attempted weak objections, but they crumbled under the weight of overwhelming proof. Across the aisle, Emma sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The pain of betrayal was etched across her face, but her shoulders remained straight, her resolve unbroken. Ethan caught her eye and gave a slight nod. She returned it, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had chosen this path, knowing the cost, knowing the truth had to prevail. When the jury filed back into the courtroom after surprisingly brief deliberations, The tension was palpable. The forewoman stood, paper trembling slightly in her hands. "On all counts, we find the defendants Brandon Ross and Robert Phillips guilty." The words rang through the courtroom like a bell. Ross's shoulders slumped in defeat, while Phillips remained rigid, his expression finally cracking as officers approached to lead them away. The room erupted in murmured conversations and rustling movement as reporters rushed for the exits. Ethan released a deep breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Beside him, Emma closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Years of secrets, lies, and pain seemed to flow away with those tears. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Under the warm morning sun, Ethan and the children gathered in the backyard, trowels and seedlings in hand. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for the memorial garden they planned to create for Claire. Each child held a small piece of paper, carefully folded and containing their private thoughts. "Mom would have loved flowers," Sophia said softly, kneeling beside a patch of freshly turned earth. She tucked her note beneath the soil, then gently placed a purple petunia on top. One by one, the children followed. Max planted marigolds, his note disappearing beneath the orange blooms. Ella chose daisies, while Ben selected snapdragons. Rose and Lily worked together on a patch of pink carnations, and Tommy carefully positioned his note under a small sunflower seedling. Ethan watched them work, his heart full. These children, once abandoned and afraid, now stood strong in their love for each other and the memory of Claire. The garden would be a living testament to her spirit and sacrifice. Emma arrived as they were preparing to plant a rose bush, her eyes red but her smile genuine. She quickly wiped away tears before joining them in the yard. Kneeling beside Ethan, she helped him position the thorny plant. "The trial was worth it," Emma said quietly, patting soil around the base of the bush. "Even with everything that happened with my father, I know we did the right thing." Ethan nodded, understanding the depth of her sacrifice. "Claire would be proud of you," he said. "Your courage helped bring justice to these children." Their eyes met over the rosebush and something warm passed between them. A shared understanding, perhaps something more. The moment lingered, tender and full of possibility. Later, they all gathered on the porch with cookies and tall glasses of lemonade. The heaviness that had weighed on them for so long seemed to lift in the afternoon light. Tommy chased Max around the yard with a water pistol, their laughter bright and unreserved. Sophia and Ella played jump rope while Rose and Lily made daisy chains. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, watching his family with peaceful contentment. The garden bloomed before them, a rainbow of colors against the green grass. It wasn't just Claire's memorial anymore. It had become a symbol of their healing, their growth, their unbreakable bonds forged through truth and love. Emma stood beside him, smiling as Ben joined his siblings' game. The shadows that had haunted them all had finally lifted, replaced by the simple joy of being together, being whole. In the workshop's soft afternoon light, Ethan's skilled hands moved deliberately over the wooden figurine. Wood shavings scattered across his workbench as he carefully refined the final details of Claire's face. The small carving showed her holding a child's hand, capturing the essence of her protective spirit. He paused, running his thumb over the smooth surface, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath his fingers. Memories of Claire's gentle smile filled his mind as he worked, each careful stroke of his tools bringing the piece closer to completion. When finished, he placed it reverently on the workshop's windowsill, where golden sunlight streamed through, highlighting the rich grain patterns in the wood. As sunset approached, the family gathered in their new memorial garden. The flowers they'd planted earlier swayed gently in the evening breeze, their bright colors painting a living rainbow against the darkening sky. Beneath the blooms lay the children's buried notes, their hopes and dreams taking root alongside the flowers. Sophia stood close to Ethan, her hand finding his. Max and Ben playfully bumped shoulders while Ella adjusted Rose's hair ribbon. Lily helped Tommy water the sunflower he'd planted, giggling as drops splashed their feet. The garden hummed with life and love, a testament to their journey together. Emma watched from a few steps away, her eyes soft with emotion. The setting sun cast long shadows across her face as she observed this family that had become so dear to her. Her smile held both joy and peaceful acceptance. As twilight settled over them, Claire's words from her letter seemed to float on the evening air. You always had the strength to be the father they needed. Now they are your truth, your legacy, and your redemption. The sky above them blazed with deep oranges and purples, nature's own celebration of their unity. The children's laughter rang out in the gathering dusk as they chased fireflies, their silhouettes dancing against the colorful horizon. Ethan watched them, his heart full, knowing that this family, bound not by blood but by love and truth, was ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Carter, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.